Good morning. My name is Carika Middelberg and I'm an analyst at the CRA. Today we are interviewing Hermann Pretorius, the head of strategic communications at the Institute of Race Relations. Today we will be discussing the newly passed budget as of yesterday to April that was approved for the 2025-26 budget. Good day, Herman, and welcome here with us. In light of the different parties voting for and against the bill in Parliament, I think the biggest question on everyone's minds is what is going to happen for the GNU, especially considering that the Democratic Alliance, the DA, voted against the budget. However, the ANC, Action SA, UDM, IFP, and BOSA were some of the parties that voted for the budget. So can you please just elaborate or explain to us what do you think is going to happen now with the future of the GNU?
So the first point of departure is the numbers. Now, the GNU has 287 seats in Parliament, 87 of which belong to the DA. So if they leave, immediately the majority of the GNU is gone, if without new members joining. One of the political realities I think we also need to face is the fact that it is difficult to see the GNU losing the DA, but not the Freedom Front Plus. During the negotiations last year, I know, having spoken to senior DA leaders at the time, that they sought the participation of the Freedom Front Plus as something of an inoculation against sellout accusations. Now, if the DA had joined the Government of National Unity without the Freedom Front Plus, it would have opened up their perhaps small letter C conservative flank of middle class Afrikaner voters that they've been the main party for since 1999, with some errors along the way, particularly in 2019. But the feeling was very much that the DA, without the Freedom Front Plus in a GNU, would be politically vulnerable to the accusations of selling out, keeping the ANC in power. So when it became clear that the Freedom Front Plus was willing to sign up to the GNU deal, it was a very useful freezing of one of the DA's main opponents, the other, of course, being the Patriotic Alliance. So it was convenient for the DA that the Patriotic Alliance, the Freedom Front Plus, and they themselves joined the Government of National Unity. It sort of protected them from the more natural predators in the political landscape, as it were. So now with the situation of the DA's exit to the GNU seeming inevitable, it's a question of when and no longer of if. It is a question as to whether the Freedom Front Plus will join the DA in leaving, because if it doesn't, it will reverse the calculus of vulnerability that some of the Freedom Front Freedom Front Plus voters might switch over to the DA for not being in the GNU, and for the Freedom Front Plus now perhaps being seen to sell out or prop up an ANC government, because the perception seems to be, if we look at the polling, that the GNU is an ANC dominated project, and that the ANC is considered to be in the driving seat, and that the GNU is losing the shine it might have had a few months ago. So if the DA leaves, I would expect the Freedom Front Plus, for pure political survival instincts, to also leave. That means that the GNU falls to 193 seats. Now, from that point, there are a few iterations of how to get back above 200 seats for the GNU. It can be done on an ad hoc basis, on a so-called confidence and supply, or a minority government basis, which are closely connected, not quite the same, but sufficient to group together as an option, where the ANC and the existing GNU are not joined around the cabinet table by new parties, that the vacated cabinet and sub-cabinet governmental posts are vacated by the DA and reassigned within the existing parties. And that would be an ANC-led GNU minority government. Now, the experience from Ekurhuleni Joburg, local government coalitions that are minority coalitions are quite tumultuous. So it would be bold, but not to be discounted at this stage for the ANC to go that direction. The second route would be to go with the EFF or MK or both. That would conveniently or comfortably push the GNU's or a reconfigured GNU's majority above 200. And then the third option would be getting smaller parties like BOSA, like Action SA, like the National Coloured Congress, the NCC, to join the cabinet table that pushes them just above the 200 mark. My read of the situation, I think, at this stage is that we've got a month, 2 months max left for the DA within the GNU. At that stage, I think something will have to give. The DA doesn't want to leave the GNU and be seen as walking out, because the public will blame it if it is seen to be sort of taking its stuff and leaving. It will try to be a bit more confrontational, stay in the GNU, dare the ANC to, as it were, kick it out, to leave on a moral high ground position. Then the most likely scenario is probably somewhere between confidence and supply GNU minority government without the DA, without the Freedom Front Plus, either supported around the cabinet table by Action SA, BOSA and the NCEC, or on occasional votes to pass things like the upcoming further legislative steps needed for the budget, the appropriations bill and the division of revenue bill.
Mhm. Yes, I think in the coming months, there's a lot of political scenarios or possible political scenarios at play. Some of the other big questions and points that was also raised in regards to the budget is the very controversial VAT hike. So, do you think the VAT hike was the only route for government to cover their revenue shortfall?
No, no, quite emphatically not. And I'll touch on that in a moment. I do think we could look at the elephant shrew in the room. It's not quite an elephant because it's quite minor, so let's call it an elephant shrew, and that is Action SA. Um, we have now had enough time since that controversial standing committee meeting on finance, where Alan Beasley of Action SA supported the fiscal framework to pass to the plenary floor, and voting for that fiscal framework to pass was, of course, Action SA, amongst others. And they now are claiming to apparently have been tricked, was one of the words used by reporters, and duped would be perhaps another one, misled, treated in bad faith by the ANC. They clearly thought that their non-binding recommendation was an amendment to the fiscal framework, which I know you've done some media appearances on. It wasn't. It was just a recommendation. It was truly a shocking indictment of the standard of parliamentary operations in South Africa. Not only was it, I think, Action SA that failed to understand what they were voting for or supporting, and what they were not voting for and not supporting, as they claim, but also I think they should earn the bulk of the condemnation and scorn, but Parliament's own advisory mechanisms and support structures failed them. Members of Parliament cannot be always expected to be legislative experts. The idea in a democracy is that these are ordinary people. Now, that is the theory, and sometimes it plays out. And what I think adds to the political embarrassment here is the fact that they were hung out to dry, clearly not understanding parliamentary matters that by rights should have been explained to them, and they should have required more clarity on. So there is an indictment on that particular elephant shrew, but that dealt with, in terms of your question, were there revenue alternatives? And as I say, emphatically, yes. In fact, the Institute of Race Relations have been, for at least a year now, been making the argument that by cutting BEE premiums in government procurement, you could find not just the fiscal headroom to maintain that at a 14% or 15% level, you can actually drop it to an 11.5% level. We could have, given the savings of BE premiums, have actually seen a VAT decrease. Now, broadly, how that works, government departments require certain goods and services to operate. You've got a government building, there are bathrooms in the building. Both those bathrooms need to be cleaned and there needs to be toilet paper. Now, Home Affairs doesn't have a toilet paper manufacturing plant somewhere. They need to procure that. Now, how the procurement system for government entities works is that these governments cannot just go to the most appealing financial contract unless they decide to. But it works in the way that the products are measured for their cost effectiveness, the services are measured for their cost effectiveness, but also the vendor, the provider of that good or service, is assessed on BEE basis. Is the company compliant enough with BEE in one way or another? And that would be a key determining factor. The calculations by the IRR indicates that procurement premium, money spent above what should be spent if it was spent on a value for money basis, amounts to anything between 100 and 150 billion rand a year. Now, if we consider that the VAT hike was intended to cover a 60 billion rand shortfall, and there's questions whether it would accomplish that, the savings that could have been achieved by cutting BE premiums, by simply introducing value for money procurement in government, would have been more than sufficient to avoid this tax hike. And that's one of many. It is perhaps politically a sensitive issue, with the ANC and others in government not necessarily eager to touch BEE. But that's just one example of where savings could have come from. And one can look at the DA's alternatives. It wasn't inevitable that VAT needed to be hiked for this budget to appear or to be sufficiently revenue neutral at the end of the day.
Yes, and I think those are important things to consider, especially the BE premiums and how they add additional money with no significant value. That was Hermann Pretorius from the IRR. Thank you so much for joining us today about our budget discussion, and we appreciate your insights. And we will all see you next week on our channel. Thank you.